Welcome to Rock, Paper, Hand Grenades. Hey, I did it right this time.
You did.
That's like the first time
did.
I actually just like went right in.
You've been doing this for how many years? Yeah.
9, I think, 8, 7.
How are you doing today, Gary?
Good. Josh, right?
Yeah,
Josh
you
Solomon.
Still haven't remembered my name.
Well, whatever. Someday. So anyway, tonight we have Adam Olsen, who is from the land down under.
Yep, the land down
So
under.
you must have like one of those big machetes or something, right? No, he didn't have a machete. What did he have?
No machete, no
That's
boomerang.
not a knife.
No boomerang.
That's not a knife.
Yeah,
You
that's
talking about Paul Hogan?
yeah. That was great.
I also don't see a platter of Vegemite sandwiches here either. So
Yeah, so this is very confusing for us. So no, I was talking to Adam at the on election day, and his story was so compelling. I really wanted to come on because to start, you informed me of some history. I mean, as an American, all we hear about is American history, and Australia is like a footnote.
speak for yourself. I read history.
Okay, well, anyway, for us ignorant historians, I understand that Australia's always been there with us from World War I on, but
That's correct, yeah.
The details are sketchy, and you were informing me about how basically how America came involvement in World War II saved Australia's bacon, basically.
Right, so this really goes back to my grandparents, who were both members of the Royal Australian Air Force. So my papa, he was a flight sergeant in the, we call it the RAF, the RAAF, Royal Australian Air Force, and his job was to fix fighter planes that were going up against the Zeros. So he was based in a place called Milne Bay in Papua New Guinea, and that was the front line for us defending Australia. Now, as I was saying to you on the writing, Gary, many Australians didn't even know at the time because it was all hidden by the media. It was top secret that Australia was literally being invaded. We had 250 air raids on Darwin, which is our northernmost city right up the top of Australia in the tropics. They were brutal. I mean, they took out the hospital that had the Red Cross painted on the roof, and that was one of the worst attacks with the most deaths.
That was one of the things that the Japanese were known for, was not abiding by any type of rules of engagement.
That's right. And I mean, what happened to a lot of our POWs, they were beheaded, and just all sorts of horrible things happened during the war effort down there. But I was raised my grandparents taught me to love this country from day one because they were right there on the front line fighting this battle against the Japanese for the very future of our country. It was literally that serious. And we were stretched because at the start of the war, our Prime Minister said, the mother country is at war, therefore we're at war. And he sent all our resources over to England.
Oh, really? I didn't know
Right,
that.
to the European theatre.
They're part of the British Empire, and
Right.
of course, Great Britain was already in the war.
Yeah.
And
we were taking this stance of non-aggression and staying out of it.
Right, so this is September 1939.
So when did Australia actually become independent of England?
We were already independent of England officially.
Okay.
We became an independent country on January 1, 1901.
Okay.
But we were still very much tied to the British Empire.
Okay.
I think that the turning point really was World War II.
Yeah, there's a lot of countries like that. I mean, Canada and India, I think, got...
Canada's actually a separate country?
Well,
Yeah. But to this day...
but yeah, there's a lot of countries like that still look to England as like you said, their mother country, and they
Right.
still have the Queen's face on money and things like that.
To this day, the Queen
Yeah.
is still our head of state,
Yeah.
even now.
Yeah. So World War II starts.
Yeah, so World War II starts, and we send most of the guys that go over are volunteers. So they go over to fight for the mother country on the front line in Europe,
As they had in World War I.
as they had in
There's
World
a lot
War
of a lot of famous Australian battles.
Right. So
Australian-led battles in Europe during World War I.
Well, it was actually led by the British forces, but
Yeah.
they instructed our generals on what they wanted us to do. In the first place, they sent us as a unit. It was actually not just the Australians; it was the Australians and the New Zealanders,
Right.
and they were called the Anzacs, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. So those boys went over and they fought at a place called Gallipoli, which is a peninsula, very strategically important. It's in Turkey, and it was a way that the British forces were going to get their navy in through this stretch of water to get into the Black Sea. And that was where we really were born as a nation. You know, that forged us as a nation, and the blood on the. I mean, that's.
Was that the one that Winston Churchill was kind of commander of?
He was in charge
and
of
it.
it.
Wasn't one of his greatest successes?
No, it was a tragedy. I mean, we lost thousands of men, and we then went on to the Western Front and various other theatres over there. But I mean, that was where we showed our mettle as a nation, and we earned a reputation as fierce warriors, and.
The Scottish showed up in skirts, so you didn't have a lot of competition, right?
Right, but no, I mean it's part of our identity, really.
Trouble.
Yeah, Anzac Day is like our Memorial Day, and it is the most solemn day in Australia. I mean, we have an equivalent of July 4, which is called Australia Day.
Yeah.
But that commemorates the founding of a penal colony, when the 11 ships sailed into Sydney Harbour, and we set up basically a prison. So that's our national day. But the day that's in every Australian's heart is Anzac Day. And we go to a dawn service, so as the sun rises, we go and we say, lest we forget the men that died, men and women that served and died for our nation. And then we have services right through till 12 o'clock. We have marches where the veterans march through the streets. And
that's wicked cool.
Yeah, and then at 12 o'clock, everyone downs tools. We all go to the pub and we have a beer and we raise a glass to the diggers, which is what we call our soldiers over there. And we play a game called Two Up, which is where you have 2 pennies on a board and you throw them up and you bet on whether it's going to be tails, heads or halves. And Australians will bet on a fly crawling up the wall. So this is what you do. The morning is all about a solemn, sombre remembrance of the people that made that sacrifice, and then the afternoon is all about raising a toast and saying thanks to a veteran.
Yeah,
it's a terrific day, and it's amazing. Even here in Boston, we have a service down in Harvard.
Oh, really?
Yep, and I've taken my son a couple of times, and there'd be 200 people there. They have the consulate generals come up from the New Zealand and Australian consulates. They have top brass from the Australian and New Zealand military. They have a padre lead the service. It's beautiful. And then afterwards, there's a place down in East Boston called KO's Catering and Pies. And he's an Australian guy. That's the only Australian restaurant around here. And he brings traditional Australian meat pies and sausage rolls. And again, we have the celebration afterwards.
Yeah.
Australian beer and wine, and we have our meat pies and all get together and taste the diggers.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So World War II starts, and we didn't get involved right away until the idiots bombed Pearl Harbor.
Right.
And to Josh's point, if you want to know the brutality of the Japanese and their relentless brutality, look up the Rape of Nanking.
Right.
It'll blow your mind how horrific it was.
Yeah.
But anyway, so they're already starting to bomb northern Australia. Then they bombed Pearl Harbor, and it was, I believe, the turning point was Midway. After Midway, the Australians, the New Zealanders, and Americans started pushing back. There was a battle. I forget which island it was. It was New Zealanders and Aussies fought the Japanese, who were basically winning every battle they went into. It was almost like a wave that couldn't be stopped. And I was watching the battle today, or the history of it, and they just attack, back off a little attack, and finally the Japanese were overextended past their supply lines, and and that was one of the first times the Japanese actually got stopped, was by the Australians and the New Zealanders.
Right.
Well, isn't supply, wasn't that one of the big issues that led to the Americans getting involved? The Japanese were waging a campaign in China and Southeast Asia.
Right, they took Singapore, they took Malaysia.
And that campaign was why they were down there in New Zealand and Papua and
yeah, well, they got to Papua New Guinea, which is, there's only it's like Cuba to Florida. That's how close they were. They were on the island of Papua New Guinea, which is where my grandfather was. My nana, she was back in Australia, and we were so stretched that they brought women into the Royal Australian Air Force, and that was not the done thing back then.
Right.
This is the 1940s.
But
and she came in and she drove the fire truck and the lorries, the supply lorries. So she was actually enlisted in the Royal Australian Air Force and was a pioneer in that regard because she was one of the first females. But I come back to what I was saying to you earlier, that my grandparents said, if it wasn't for they call everyone in America Yanks in Australia. And this is a good story, actually, I have to tell you. There was quite a lot of rivalry between the Australian military and the American military. The American guys were pretty smooth, and they were pretty good with the chicks. And they came over, and they were gentlemen. They knew how to treat the ladies, and we were not as adept at that. So anyway, the Australians the Australians were very jealous of the American servicemen, especially the Navy guys, and so they came up with this term. We have rhyming slang in Australia, so you tend to make up a nickname for someone. It's got to rhyme with something. So you have Yanks, so they had to think of something that rhymed with Yanks. So they came up with septic tanks, and it was because the Americans were full of what.
Right.
So septic tanks, and then it got shortened to seppos. So Australians to this day still call Americans seppos.
Nice.
Which is
military or all American?
All Australians now call, well, it's kind of it's old terminology now, it goes back, but jokingly, and you're our friends, you're our allies.
Right.
But it's Australians are like that, they
well,
take
even the servicemen, even men in the service still today, the Marines and the Armies fight side by side, but they still
same sort of rivalry.
There's still rivalry.
Yeah,
it's kind of neat.
So that whole supply chain thing was kind of why we got drawn into it, right? Because the Japanese were overextending themselves.
Right.
Were overextending themselves with this massive campaign. And they were in need of supply lines closer to where they were fighting, including oil. And they had been trying desperately to say to America, stay out of it, but hey, sell us some oil, some oil. And when they got to a breaking point with those negotiations over oil and supplies and things like that, which is where they ended up bombing us, thinking they're going to take some of our resources. And us getting involved actually made their supply chain worse, which was part of how we were able to, we created this basically this Pacific wall, Australia, New Zealand, the Hawaiian Islands, and we just said, you're not passing this line anymore. We're done with it. And that overextension that the Japanese were experiencing just got worse from there.
Right.
Which is again led to them getting more and more desperate in their tactics, which led them to being more and more grotesque and gruesome in the things that they were willing to do to make advances.
Yeah, so I mean the peak of that campaign, I guess, was in PNG in Papua New Guinea, and there was a famous battle fought on. The Americans and the Australians disagree on the name, but it's either the Kokoda Trail or the Kokoda Track. And that's exactly what happened. The Japanese troops got up into the highlands of Papua New Guinea, which is some of the most brutal, jungle. It's Vietnam on steroids, But the only guys we had left were like ragtag volunteers. This was like the National Guard coming in at the final hour because all our professional soldiers were on the European front. But that was where we finally got them backing up, and then with the help of the Americans. We were able to push back, and then the Pacific War started, and that's where you got the kamikaze pilots and all that sort of...
Right, because that wasn't a tactic that they had in the very beginning.
No,
again,
right.
That was one of their more desperate policies.
So for the younger viewers, kamikaze pilots they'd basically load up a Zero with explosives, and as soon as they would put the pilot in there, and then they would weld the hatch shut, and then as soon as they took off, the wheels fell out from the plane, and it
I
was
didn't know that.
basically a guided missile, an early guided missile that was very, very successful, but luckily it came after a few defeats, so it was kind of too little too late. But
Yeah.
they actually had Japanese soldiers in torpedoes.
Yeah, so we actually had we had
Oh, I
an
know that one. Yeah, go ahead.
we had an incursion in Sydney, which is our biggest city,
That's the one I'm thinking
and
of.
yeah, they had they had 3 midget subs released from a larger submarine, and one of them actually got right past. We had like fencing under the water to stop the submarines from coming in, but these midget subs were able to go, close enough to the surface to get by that. And yeah,
That's a very interesting read. If you read about that, the midget subs in Sydney Harbor, there were
Yeah.
3 of them. One of them got caught up and was actually spotted, but the
Yeah.
person doing the spotting it didn't register to him that was a Japanese sub. He thought it was just
Right.
a fishing vessel or something else caught up.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until an explosion took place across the harbor that they started to reinvestigate these things that were suspicious.
Right, and it was actually one of the targets that they bombed there, and I don't know whether this is intentional or not. I can't remember. I'm sorry, but they hit a hospital ship with Australian troops, and there was a couple of dozen guys that were killed there. And they just lobbed a couple of random torpedoes into the south shore of Sydney, which is just crazy. I mean, that's when it really hit home for Australians. They couldn't hide that. Even though the government was censoring the news that was coming out of Darwin because they didn't want panic and mass hysteria. Once you had submarines.
So you say sometimes government doesn't
Isn't entirely forthcoming with
isn't entirely
information.
forthcoming because they don't want people to panic and buy all the toilet paper.
One thing that happened during this period, and I learnt this from my grandparents, and then I learned it at school after, and thank God they were actually teaching it at school. But the General Douglas MacArthur was the American general in charge of the defence of Australia, and he drew what was called the MacArthur Line, which was a line pretty much just above Brisbane, where he was going to let the Japanese take that part of Australia and starve their defence, supply lines, because you've got desert and just open space in Australia. There's nothing there, and so his idea was just to get them out in the middle of nowhere and have them.
And let them die of starvation.
Right, but no Australians knew anything about that. They made sure
It's
that
actually not a bad plan.
it wasn't a bad strategy. It never came to that, touch wood, thankfully. But yeah, that's what happened. I mean, he decided he was going to let them get into the harshest part of Australia, where the only people that can survive are Indigenous Australians. And yeah,
And we're simple folk. We're not privy to those types of things, right? So that's the type of plan that were in place. You got to plan ahead.
right.
Believe it or not, those are the types of things that are already in place. These contingencies, these they're already in place for attacks on U.S. homeland or
Oh, I'm sure.
or certain areas of Europe. These types of plans are already in place. If it comes to it.
Yeah,
and
they-
that was
they-
probably exactly what that was.
Yeah, they
It's
plan
like-
on letting Manchester fall, and then they're going to stop them in Goffstown.
I don't think they're going to get to Manchester, because to get to Manchester, you got to get through all the Irish people in Boston.
Right.
That's just
Oh
not
yeah,
going to happen.
yeah. No, I thought they go through. I think they go through Portland, where it'd be pretty soft. Anyway, so we go from World War II. America is and Australia are very close.
Yes.
We've been fighting every single war since Vietnam, Afghanistan.
Yep.
And
I think even more so than England, Australia has been at our side everywhere.
Absolutely, and there's a couple of points on this. I mean, we had the what was called the ANZUS Treaty, which was a treaty between Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. Now, I think it was around about the late 1980s. There was a very liberal prime minister in New Zealand, and he pulled them out of he pulled New Zealand out of the ANZUS Treaty, so it became the Oz Treaty. And the reason he did that was because he didn't want nuclear-powered warships coming into Auckland. We had no such issue with that. And it's quite a spectacle when an American ship comes into Sydney Harbour.
Oh, really?
It's amazing. And I was very privileged. One of the first jobs I had in Australia, I was working for a telco. It was the first private company running telecommunications in Australia. That did not happen until 1992, believe it or not. We had a
Really?
state-owned, it was called Telecom, and that was our only phone service. So when I started working for this company, we were so popular because the state-owned company was obviously terrible and they didn't care about customer service or
Right,
delivering a good service. But one of the things we did, they sent ambassadors down to Woolloomooloo, which is the naval base in Sydney where the American ships come in. And when the Americans arrived, they would send us over to go out with the mobile phones, and we'd wait for them as they got off the ship for their leave, their shore leave. And we'd say, look, would you like to call your family back home? Do you want to speak to any of your mates? And they were just gobsmacked. I mean, they were so appreciative, and all these
Really?
guys, they were lovely. And one of the ships that came in when I did this was the USS Missouri. So after I'd been
Wow.
doing this, these guys took me on board the vessel and took me to the table that's covered in perspex where they signed the treaty. And I can feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing
Wow.
up right now. You know, that was Victory in the Pacific Day was right there on that vessel. And I've been to that desk where that happened. Now that ship...
For the viewers, USS Missouri is pulled into Tokyo Harbor, right?
That's right. It was in Tokyo Bay, and we had our representatives. The Americans obviously were there, and the Japanese representatives to sign the end of World War II. That's where it all happened, on that vessel. And the wonderful thing they've done, and you probably already know this, but just for the viewers' benefit, the Missouri now sits side by side with the Arizona in Pearl Harbor, bookending the beginning of America's
Oh, I
involvement
didn't
in
know
World War
that. That
II
is
and
actually
the end.
cool.
And that's another place I've been privileged to be, is the memorial at Pearl Harbor. That is chilling when you're sitting over that thing. I went there in 1991, the first time I came over here with my mates. I came over here prior to that with family, but we did a 6-week trip over here. And back then, you couldn't fly direct to Los Angeles. You actually had to stop in Honolulu because the plane couldn't make the trip. It was so far. That's how old I am. But one of the first things we did was we went straight to Pearl Harbor, and we did that trip out to the Arizona. And I don't know if it's still the case, but you could still see the oil leaking out of that. You could see the rainbows in the water.
Wow.
And another moment that made the hairs on the back of my neck.
So we're getting long on time, low
Right.
on time. So that was 1992. You visited San Francisco. What was that like in '92?
It was a beautiful city. It's Sydney's sister city. So, we have a lot of similarities. We've got the beautiful harbour. We have our iconic bridge. So they've got the Golden Gate. We've got the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And it's our sister city. So we always learnt about that at school. Learned about San Francisco because it had that relationship with us. And I had a lovely visit. It was a beautiful city, and we went down the coast road to Los Angeles and then flew over to New York and did the next circuit there.
So now,
Down the coast of Los Angeles. That's
Yeah.
like a 7-hour drive.
Yeah, it was a great drive. Beautiful. I recommend that drive. Not the interstate.
So then you visited San Francisco later.
Yeah, so my wife and I were married over here in New Hampshire, and just actually down at St Gardens in Cornish. Beautiful place, yeah. But we missed a flight, and we ended up being stranded in San Francisco for the day.
What year is this now?
This is 2001.
Okay.
Yeah, 2001. So this is not long before 9/11. Yeah, so we were married here in June, and we spent the day in San Francisco, and I hired a car and I showed my wife around because I'd seen the city, and we had a wonderful day, and it was still very beautiful.
So now tell them what it looks like now.
So this is really unfortunate, but the last time I went back, when we first moved over here in December 2014, we bought a camper and an SUV, and we spent 6 months travelling around America. And it was around about 3 months in we hit San Francisco, and I hadn't been there since our wedding, so we're fast forwarding 14 years. And we had the kids with us, obviously, and we got a camping spot just north of the Golden Gate, and we came into town and parked. I dropped the kids and my wife off at Fisherman's Wharf, and then I had to find a parking spot, and I was about a mile away, and I walked back, and all I could smell was human feces and urine. And, that was the first time I saw tents in the parks and, all that sort of thing that is now just par for the course right up and down the west coast of the United States, or the left coast as I like to call it.
Wow.
Yep, it's pretty much every city, and it didn't take long to deteriorate to that.
Right. I mean, it was shocking. I mean, I was really looking forward to that part of our trip, and I talked it up to Jody, and Jody had seen it, but the kids hadn't. And Reagan and Sydney were very much looking forward to it, and we went out to Alcatraz, which was pretty neat. But the time we spent in town, it was filthy, it was dirty, it was scary. You didn't feel comfortable.
Yeah.
It wasn't like walking around Sydney.
Yeah, there's a lot of metropolitan cities around the world, not just in the United States, that have gone that route where they've been run by liberals for so long.
Yeah.
That's what's well, not even so long, right? I mean, New York City was cleaned up quite well by Rudy Giuliani.
Well,
right?
it's interesting you mentioned
but
New York.
Since
yeah.
he's left, it's gone right back to the crime haven that we think of in the 1970s. Right. Paris has gone the same way.
Yep.
I've been there multiple times, and I have no desire to ever go back.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you said, the feces in the street, the smell, but it's always in these liberal-run cities.
Right. And I mean, you mentioned New York, and the next place we went to on that trip that I mentioned back in 1991, we went to New York, and that was pre-Giuliani. And we were staying in a youth hostel way up in Harlem. And it was mayhem, there was just police everywhere, and, there was a lot of violence on the streets, and it was all in our face. And my two mates I was travelling with, they just said, we don't want to stay here, I want out. And so we got on a Greyhound and we went up to Boston, and we actually spent a few extra days up there instead.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I saw the New York pre-Giuliani and then after, and you're absolutely right. I mean, it was terrible, and that was years ago, going back to the early 90s, but he cleaned it up, and now, unfortunately, it's going right back in the other direction under de Blasio.
So so you leave Australia,
Mm-hmm.
you came to the land of the free. What's happened, have you seen happening in Australia over these years?
Oh, it's terrible. Where to start? Probably the best place to start is 1996. We had a mass shooting at a beautiful place called Port Arthur, which is one of our penal colonies dating back to the early 1800s in Tasmania, which is our smallest state. It's a little island just below Victoria. So very different part of Australia. But we had this madman come in, and he had a semi-automatic weapon, and he killed 36 people. And Australia has a very different culture anyway when it comes to guns. Most Australians are not familiar with firearms. There tends to be a bit of a fear and paranoia with them. And any time anything like this happened, the public would go nuts, and they'd really pressure the government to act. Now, my dad was a farmer and grazier, so, I grew up around firearms. We had kangaroos eating our wheat crop, wild pigs, that sort of thing that, would attack your dingoes, that would eat your livestock. And so, I grew up in an area where guns were pretty much the norm. But
Wait, did you kill kangaroos?
yes, it's actually kangaroos are in our coat of arms. But they are a pest.
I was going to say, they're a pest.
I know, I'm just joking, because I'm sure that most people think of them as just this
cuddly kangaroos.
bunny with a bad attitude.
Winnie the Pooh.
Yeah.
I'm just being a jerk. Go ahead.
No, so anyway, to move on, our Prime Minister at the time, who was a very good friend of George W. Bush, John Howard, he was here during the 9/11 attacks and was stranded in the United States for days until even he could get back as Prime Minister of Australia. So he was our...
Well, so he did. Why didn't he just fly out with the Saudis?
I'll leave that
Gary.
one alone. Yeah, so anyway... John Howard, who was pretty conservative for the most part, the one thing he wasn't conservative in was his attitude to firearms. And,
oh, really?
And he was the guy that engineered the gun buyback program. And it was only 2 years later that he basically took the weapons away from the people that weren't in rural areas.
So that was my next question. So rural farmers, how is it? How
So
does it work
to
there?
this day there are exemptions, but for me, I remember this was very very confronting. And I remember there was an NRA ad back, it was either the 2012 or the 2008 campaign. And you should try and find the YouTube of it, Gary, because it was a very effective ad. But it must have been 2016 actually. It had Obama and Hillary talking about how Australia has sensible laws. We're not going to take your guns. And then they had a headline, and it was a full-page advertisement in the Sydney Morning Herald, which is our main paper in Sydney. And I remember these ads, and it said owning a firearm for your personal protection is no longer your right. You will go to jail for X amount of years. You'll be fined X amount of dollars.
Wow.
I mean, that's what happened. I had no right to protect my family. And one of the last things that happened to me in Australia, when my wife was actually over here visiting with family, we were broken and entered into in our house. And I had no right to have a firearm to protect my family. I slept through the whole thing. I had a very heavy flu. But the next day, waking up to my government laptop gone, my son's iPod, my wallet, my iPhone, and it's just a sickening feeling. But in Ware, I know why the crime rates are so low, because every would-be criminal out there, anyone who thinks they're going to case out a house and take everything, they're going to be thinking twice about it before they come into a home in Ware.
Right.
Because, they know that a good percentage of the population there are locked and loaded and ready to go.
Right.
It's a deterrent, and we don't have that deterrent in Australia anymore.
So one of the big things that keeps that from disappearing here in the United States is our Second Amendment.
Right.
It's essentially written in stone.
It is. Don't rely on it.
Well, no, I understand that, but that's enough of us are fighting for that. But Australia never had that in the first place.
No,
they never had.
We don't, and we borrowed a lot of.
And so it was very easy to.
It was easy, and I was saying to Gary on the way in that a part of our constitution and our setup of government is borrowed from the United States. So, for example, our upper house, the Senate in Australia, we have equal representation of the states in terms of the number of senators. So every state has 12 senators, and we borrowed that directly from the US model of government. But what we don't have is the Bill of Rights. We have a constitution, but we do not have the Bill of Rights. And I move on to my next point of what's happening in Australia and how serious this is. And the amendment that I really think is the most important one here is the First Amendment. Because we never had a First Amendment rights, and what has happened in Australia since this coronavirus hit is just absolutely staggering.
Yep. One story that I know of a couple of weeks ago, there was a massive protest.
Mm-hmm.
I believe it was in Sydney, but the protest was an anti-lockdown protest.
Yes.
Right? It was, we don't want to wear the masks. We don't want to be locked down. We want our businesses to open up.
Mm-hmm.
We want the economy back. So it was an anti-lockdown protest because the government has locked everything down due to coronavirus. A reporter, not participating in the protest,
Yep.
simply there to take pictures
Mm-hmm.
and record history. The reporter was the first one arrested
Right.
and thrown in handcuffs.
Right.
And I read that story, and like I said earlier, Australia and the United States have been side by side for decades, right? For over a century, we've been the closest of allies.
Right.
And I just could not believe that was taking place in Australia. That this freedom of the press does not exist down there, and that, I don't know, it was very offensive to me that was taking place.
It's tragic, and as an Australian watching this happen, and I've set up a Facebook page with the help of a couple of other Aussies, and we have a group of conservative Australians, and we're talking about this every day, and we're shaking our head and just saying, what the heck happened to our country? But that is the tip of the iceberg, the story you just related. I'll give you a better one. The epicenter of the lockdown and Liberal rule is happening in the state of Victoria, which is where our second biggest city, Melbourne, is. So in Victoria, there's a town well out of Melbourne, rather, in rural Victoria called Ballarat, which was one of the gold rush towns. So after the gold rush in California, a lot of people went to Australia because that's where the next big gold rush boom was. So Ballarat's this touristy gold rush town. well away from Melbourne, a couple of 100 kilometres away. And there's very few COVID cases in rural Victoria. The whole outbreak is in Melbourne. But the Premier, who's like the Governor of Victoria, he's the equivalent of what a governor is here at the state, he's locked down the whole state. He's applied all the rules to the entire state, regardless of the severity of the outbreak. So rural Victoria has been treated exactly the same, one size fits all, as Melbourne. So just to cut to the chase, there was a lady in Ballarat who just had enough. And she went onto Facebook and created an event to have on Saturday morning, have an anti-lockdown protest in a park in Ballarat. That's all she did. The next day, the Victorian police knocked on her door. She's 8 months pregnant, about to go out for an ultrasound. She had 2 little kids there. Her husband live Facebooked her, getting cuffed in front of her children, taken down to the police station and arrested for incitement.
Wow.
Incitement. And she is going to be charged. Well, she's being charged, but she will be found guilty. And she will get whatever penalty the judge chooses to throw at her. But that was just... And she was trying to reason with them. She was there with the police saying, I'll take it down. I didn't know. And they just said, look, ignorance is no excuse. And, she went on TV and did a couple of interviews afterwards. But this is the most frightening part. The comment sections of those news stories where she went back and explained her side of the story, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of comments supporting the government, saying the government are just trying to save us from dying from this terrible disease. She did the wrong thing. She deserves these penalties.
Wow.
And we're all sitting here as Australians that live here, we're Australian by birth, but we're American by choice. By the way, my second anniversary as an American citizen was September 19. So
Oh,
2 years
congratulations.
and 3 days I've been an American.
So you can vote for me.
I can vote for you.
Yeah, good. That's
Yeah.
all. That's all.
Already have in
That's
the
all.
primary.
That's all I care about.
Right.
So this will be your first presidential.
This is my first presidential election, and it's going to be a great honour.
It's got to be a toss-up, right?
It's going to be a great honour to cast my vote for Joe Biden. Just kidding. But no, I'm very excited about this election. This is something I've waited for a long time. When I started this process in 2012, and it's
Right.
not easy. I mean, that's another thing I don't think a lot of folks here understand. When we look at the illegal immigration issue in this country, which is massive, when you come to America as a guest, you got to prove yourself if you do it the right way. I had to show the American government that I could fend for myself and look after my family, that I could pay medical bills, that I could buy my own house, that I had money in the bank to support myself if I couldn't get a job. I had to have a health test.
Yep.
I had to prove that I didn't have a whole heap of different diseases. I'd actually been waiting so long for my citizenship. Sorry, I beg your pardon, my permanent residency. So we applied in 2012. We were coming over here late 2014. I thought I'd be done and dusted well and truly by then. Well, I wasn't. By the time we'd sold everything and we had to leave, we were nearly 3 years into the process, and I was still waiting for my final interview. And because I'd lodged in Sydney, I had to do it in Sydney. But by this stage, we had to move. We'd already made our minds up to go. So I came here on a tourism visa, and I had to renew that after 3 months in order to be able to stay with my family. So we did a big trip around the States, spent 6 months travelling around in a camper, and it was in May that I got the email from the US Citizenship and Immigration Service saying you need to get back to Sydney and finish this up.
Right, right.
So I flew back to Sydney. I had my interview. The lady was from Sunapee that interviewed me.
Oh, that's actually pretty funny.
Yeah. And then I had my health check. And
No, you have to go
yeah.
to become an
To
American.
go to Sydney to talk to someone from Sunapee.
Because I lodged in Australia, and this is my own hard luck, and I probably should have done more research, but I didn't realise how long it was going to take. But the point I'm making is if you do this legally, and I'm not complaining about it, please don't get me wrong for a minute, it's a privilege for me to come to this country. It's a privilege that I have to earn and I have to prove. And there's no way that, I was going to do it any other way than the way I did it. But it was tough. It was very tough. And I was stranded in Australia for 2 months for various reasons I won't go into. The computer system at USCIS broke down. They had to prioritise farm workers because there were literally, grapes dying on the, on the on the line. So, yeah, they had to prioritise the people that really needed to come in, and I wasn't one of those people, and I get that. But, my kids were very upset and anxious. They were kept saying to their mum, is Dad ever going to be allowed to come home?
What does he look like? I don't remember, and stuff like that.
A lot of tearful FaceTime calls, and it was a tough time. But,
So, what do you see happening in the United States that is alarming you?
Let's go back to the last election, and I saw what Hillary was saying, when she, in her unguarded moments, what she was saying about the Second Amendment, what she was saying about the First Amendment, the direction they were going to. It just had so many parallels to what's happened in my lifetime in Australia. The Australia I grew up in was not dissimilar to the United States. I'm 49 years old, and one of the reasons I wanted to come on your show today, Gary, is to send a warning that this is a pivotal election. The last one, every election from here on in is a pivotal election, unfortunately. But I remember my wife was not a big fan of Donald Trump. She, didn't like the tweets, didn't like the brash, over confidence.
He is all of that.
And she didn't like Hillary, but she said, I don't think I can vote for this guy. And I said, well, you spent 14 years in Australia, Dale. This is your choice right now. You can keep America as it is, as the republic that it is, with the constitution it has, or you can allow America to become Australia. The choice is yours. And boy, it was tough sitting out that election. You have no idea how I was feeling sitting at home while she was going into the polling booth, doing the right thing, thankfully. But
or at least she said she did.
Well, she said she did, and I'm sure she did. But I think that was a pivotal moment for her. And she's a strong woman, and she makes her own mind up, and she doesn't listen to a damn thing I tell her. But
So here we have an opportunity. So you're talking about your wife. She wasn't quite sure about Donald Trump in 2016. Right. And quite a few conservatives, true conservatives, weren't quite sure about Donald Trump. But now, in 2020, our experience is that those folks who weren't quite sure about Trump have now got a firm understanding of who they're voting for and are enthusiastic about it. How about your wife?
Yes, she's definitely in that camp. She still doesn't like a lot of things about the president's behaviour. I'm the opposite, and I'll tell you why. My last job in Australia, I was Chief of Staff to a Member of Parliament, which is the equivalent of a congressman. And I used to say to my boss all the time, in Australia we have a national taxpayer-funded broadcasting company called the ABC. It's a huge monolith. I mean, it's a sheltered workshop for bad journalists, that can't get a gig in the private sector. So
we have that. It's called NPR.
Well, it's worse than NPR because it's 100% funded. It's completely overblown, but it's 100% funded by the Australian taxpayer. And they are literally Labor operatives with press passes. The Labor Party's the equivalent of the Democratic Party in Australia.
Right.
Or the Greens, which is an even worse party in Australia, who hold, unfortunately, the balance of power in our Senate. The Greens Party, we have about 8 or 9 Green senators, which is frightening, but we have to negotiate with them, or we had to when I was working for the government. Anyway, I used to say to my boss, because he'd have to go on the ABC all the time, and whether it be TV or radio, and I'd just say, Bob, why don't you call them out? It's so obvious, their bias is so obvious. Just compare with how the softball interview, your mate up the road, Joel Fitzgibbon, who was our neighbouring Labor MP, he'd get a free ride at ABC Newcastle. Bob would come in and they put him through the ringer. I mean, it's like this ridiculous situation now with Joe Biden, where he takes 5 questions from 5 handpicked journalists and, reads off a teleprompter to answer questions. And then Trump sits there for 2 hours. But the best thing about this guy and the approach he's taken, and I love him for it, is he has exposed the media.
Oh, big time.
He has exposed the media. And another thing I did back in Australia, I did a diploma of journalism. And I was in a class of 90 people, and I was one of 3 conservatives in that class. And I learned in 1990 the sort of people that go into journalism.
And the sort of people that are teaching them and training them.
Right.
So what do you mean?
Well,
more specific.
For whatever reason, and I've never been able to wrap my head around it, most people that want to enter this profession are very, very left-wing. And so the class I was in, I was one of 3 conservatives. And I was a pariah at that college because I had a different point of view. But this whole thing where journalists have become opinion people. They're not reporting anymore. They're delivering their opinion of what the
Yeah.
news should be. It's been around for a long time in Australia, and that's another precursor that I saw a long time before I think I saw it here. I mean, I think you guys could probably tell me better than I know, but I just feel like watching a news broadcast, because I used to watch like Good Morning America and whatnot back in Australia when I get home from a late shift, and it didn't seem anywhere near as bad as it is now, like 20 years ago. I don't know.
It was a
Not as bad as it wasn't as bad as it is now.
Mm-hmm.
It was
but
still pretty bad.
It was still pretty bad.
Yeah.
And I think what started the radicalization of the left-wing media was just the overwhelming support for Ronald Reagan.
Right.
The 1984 election, where there was
One
one
state.
blue state.
Beautiful.
Right. I mean, that just sent the press into a tizzy. And you got Sam Donaldson saying that if George Bush wins the White House, I'm going to savage him, because Sam Donaldson was the White House reporter for.
Right.
So yeah, that's when the media really started to turn down. Was the late '80s.
Right, and this is why I admire Trump so much, is because he has been the first politician that had that had the guts to just call this out and just say it. And when
Aren't we all sitting at the screen saying, "Say it,
Right.
do it"? Right.
Right.
I'm saying it to Bush. I'm saying it to Bush Jr.
Yeah.
Right?
Mitt Romney,
Right.
and my boss came back to me and he
Mitt,
said, "Yeah," but my boss came back and said, "Adam, you don't understand. Mate, it's politics. You've just got to. You look like a sore loser, or you look like you're a coward.
That's the problem. Is everybody is trained and,
Right.
and conditioned to play ball. And
Exactly.
We can't play ball anymore.
No, and this guy has turned the whole. He's turned the whole thing upside
Oh,
down.
he was. I was listening to one of his speeches the other day, and the way he mocks the press.
Mm.
He's doing
Oh,
this.
he needles them on purpose.
Oh yeah, constantly, right? So he's saying he's talking about how he's talking to his wife, and he said, "Oh, first lady, you got to sit down and watch the news tonight. There's going to be a great story." And then he waits, and there's a fire in California. So, well, first lady, a fire's pretty important, And he goes on, and finally the news is over, and he goes, "First lady, that's weird. I was just nominated for a second Nobel Prize, and I didn't see any." So he is. All the liberals that I ever heard throughout history would always say, "We want peace. We want a president
Right.
that provides peace."
Right.
So they elect Obama. We had the completely almost the disruption in the Middle East, Afghanistan. All over the world, there was wars and
Right.
and countries being taken over. Egypt was completely uprooted, and Hillary was so proud of killing Gaddafi. You had this whole thing going on under Obama, but he got a Nobel Peace Prize. Trump has had 4 years with no war.
Right, and that's what he promised he'd do. He's delivered.
He said he was going to do it, and he
He hasn't
didn't.
expanded. He is reduced.
He's reduced.
And he's even gotten flack from top generals for doing the reducing.
Right, the leftovers from the Obama
So then-
administration.
One thing that the Democrats haven't been able to do for 20 years or over 20 something years is get some sort of peace deal in the hot spot in the world, which is the Middle East. He's got 2 peace treaties in the last month.
Right.
Month,
But
right?
not even just the Democrats. I mean,
But my
Bush
point-
failed to deliver as well.
But my point is, he's done some things that if Obama had done them, they'd have parades in the street
Exactly.
for.
Yeah.
But CNN, MSDNC, and the rest of them downplay it or don't even cover it.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a throwback. You mentioned President Reagan. I mean, his saying was peace through strength,
Right.
and that's we're rebuilding the military. Trump is, running the same sort of game plan. And I mean, I'm a huge fan of President Reagan, so much so that I named our firstborn son Reagan.
I heard you mention his name, and I thought,
Yeah, so we wanted an American name and an Australian name. So Reagan is the American name, and my daughter is Sydney.
nice.
That's cute. Yeah, it's Yeah, the media is so left. You know, the one bright shining thing for me in this last year was because typically, if you watch the news, it's really, you could listen to CNN, and if you lean that way, you're going to believe them.
Right.
If you watch Fox, you're going to believe them, right?
Right.
Because you really have no access to what actually happened at any given thing.
Mm-hmm.
The one bright shining moment in the last year was in December of 2019 when you had the Inspector General report. And I posted that all over the place because you could actually read the report itself
Exactly.
and then watch Rachel Maddow lie about it.
Mm-hmm.
In the IG report, it said that the initial investigation was because FFG, which was Foreign Friendly Government,
Mm-hmm.
which was probably Christopher Steele, I don't know. But anyway, Foreign Friendly Government tipped them off.
Right.
So that's all they needed to open up the investigation. Very low threshold. I could have called him and said, hey, I think
Right.
this happened, right?
Right.
That's all it was. But to actually have the real investigation where you get wiretapping and all this other stuff, the FISA court,
Mm-hmm.
they needed the Steele document.
Right.
And that was clear in the IG report.
Mm-hmm.
Rachel Maddow went on TV and said, see, they didn't need the Steele dossier because she knew that that was crap.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't need the Steele dossier to open up the Russia investigation. She's lying.
Right.
They absolutely needed
Absolutely,
to actually really open it up. Technically, you could, if you split hairs, she was deceptive and wasn't technically lying, but her point was to lie to the American public and tell them. But that was one of the cases where you could actually read the document, watch the news, and realize who was actually telling the truth. And the only real news organization that was telling the truth through that whole thing, one of them was Sean Hannity.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I find him annoying, but he told the truth all the way through.
Right.
You know?
Right.
I'm sorry, Sean. He's a friend of mine. I do hang out with him, but
Yeah. So what else do you want us to? What else do you want to warn us about? So Australia, they've given up the guns. They no longer have free speech. What about? Oh, this is the other one I'm curious about because this is one I've been fighting up at the State House.
Yeah.
Monitoring people.
Yeah.
Is it turning into a police state also?
Well, I mean, the case I mentioned with the Facebook thing, you know, there's a lot of... this.
now, did the police find her themselves, or were they tipped off?
They would have been
Somebody
tipped off.
complained.
And this is a terrible
red
thing that's
flag
happened.
laws.
Well, there's not red flag laws as such, but I mentioned to you the comments field on the news story about that woman and how many Australians were absolutely in favour of what the government is doing in keeping them safe from COVID. But what we're seeing is this culture of dobbing. What do you call it here? You know, where
What's a dobbing?
telling on someone,
Okay.
tittle-tattling, what is it?
Tattletale.
Yeah, tattletale. So it's called dobbing in Australia, where you dob in your neighbour.
Snitches get stitches.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. But this is just becoming commonplace now. You know, I mean, I don't know if I should use this, but it's kind of like, you know, the Hitler Youth. You know, dobbing in family. And families are really splitting up. I mean, I should probably tell you about the whole quarantine situation in Australia right now, and what it would be like for me to get home in an emergency. This is one of the things that Australians that are over here are very upset about. So the government have limited flights to Australia to 30 passengers per plane. Now, you can't get on a 737 and go to Australia. You need a big aircraft. You know, you've got to cross the Pacific Ocean. So in order for the airlines to make any kind of money, the only tickets they're selling are first class. And now we've got this queue backed up for months to get home. And it's going to cost you $10,000 minimum to get the one-way flight back home if you have to go back. Now, I've already spoken to a couple of Aussies that have been through this. When you get off the plane, you are met by the police and the military. You are taken through customs and several extra checkpoints. You are loaded onto a bus. You are then taken to a hotel in Sydney, 3-star hotel, the Travel Lodge. They put you in the room, take away your card, and you sit there for 2 weeks. They bring food and water to you in your room. You're not even allowed out for an hour's exercise. You have to quarantine. Now, my passport says that the Queen gives me the right to move freely between countries. I don't have the right to go home right now. You know, if I am going to go home, that quarantine, by
Do
the
they
way,
charge
is
you for the hotels?
$3,000 is the rate for the hotel. So the Australian
Wow.
dollar's trading at about 70 US cents. So do the math, but it's a good whack of change. But one of the people on our page, her father was involved in a very serious motorcycle accident around about 2 months ago. She only managed to get a flight home like 3 or 4 days ago. He's still in intensive care. She's currently in quarantine, waiting to see her
So he
father.
might die while she's in quarantine.
Right, and then they've closed down state borders. There's literally a closed border right now between New South Wales and Queensland. Another anecdote I was telling you about on the way here was a girl who lost her dad. He died in Queensland. She was in New South Wales. Now this is like New Hampshire and Massachusetts. A lot of people cross either way to work or live, and that's completely shut down right now. The benevolent leader of Queensland, Premier Palaszczuk, allowed her, and they've got photos of this, and this was a viral, worldwide news story of her going into the morgue in full PPE, like with not just a mask, like a hazmat suit almost, going into the morgue to say goodbye to her father because she wasn't allowed to go to the funeral. She wasn't allowed to go. That's all she was allowed to do, was to be taken by the police to the morgue to see her dad on the slab, straight back to New South Wales. That's how she got to farewell her dad while the rest of her family were at the funeral.
So,
Wow.
we see Australia slowly, probably quicker than we'd like, quicker than anyone would like, slipping into socialism.
Right.
Here in the United States, we have elections. We have the ability to appoint Supreme Court justices, which we didn't get into today. We probably will next week.
Mm-hmm.
So we're coming up on a pivotal moment here in November here in the United States, and I firmly believe that after that election and after all the lawsuits that follow that election,
Mm-hmm.
that we're going to see some major changes in how the lockdown is handled. We're going to see some major changes in how people view government and government overreach.
Right.
What does Australia have for recourse there?
Nothing.
Elections.
Well, there are
you know,
elections, obviously. I mean, the
you know.
most of the state governments are 4-year terms. The Premier I just told you about, Premier Palaszczuk, the Labor Premier of Queensland, she faces the polls in 6 weeks. But the polling is showing that she's got a good chance of holding on to government. And this is what I'm saying. A lot of
so there's
Australians...
not enough people upset about this.
No, a lot of Australians think, a lot of Queenslanders think she's keeping us safe. And I told you about our group of Australians that live here, that the Facebook page I manage, a lot of us are at war with our own families. I mean, my parents are pretty okay with how things are right now. And, I
Hey,
said...
we only got 2 minutes, so
Right.
what's the last? You get the last word on telling the voters what you want to say.
Well, as I said earlier, I mean, this is a pivotal election, and I think every election from here on in is a fight to save the Republic and the Constitution. It really is that serious. And I wanted to be here on your show to explain what's happened in the course of my lifetime, but there's a few things you really want to watch out for in the United States that happened in Australia recently that could happen here. Ranked choice voting. That is the norm in Australia now, and that means that you can have, and I don't know if you guys were familiar with the 2nd District contest in Maine in the last election, where the incumbent Republican got knocked over, even though he had more votes than
The Maine Supreme Court just announced today that they're allowing ranked choice to be the method for the presidential election in November, and that's a
Right, so that's already part and parcel of every federal election in Australia. The other thing you really want to watch out for is compulsory voting. We are forced to go to the polls in Australia. It doesn't matter if you don't know a thing about what's going on. You are forced to go into that booth and check a box.
So you're
need to
you're
think about
forcing the people that are least equipped to go, who will probably be voting for whoever spent
They're
the most
told.
money.
Right, and first-time voters are a real target market for left-leaning governments down there or opposition. So, yeah, compulsory voting is very scary because the people that they are marching into the polling booth really have literally no idea what they're doing.
Wow.
That's what they did in Baghdad. That's how these regimes claim legitimacy.
Yeah, there's a
All right,
monetary
we got to
fine.
go. We're over time.
Okay.
We're over time. Yeah. Hey, Adam, thank you very
See you
much.
next
We'll
week.
see you guys next
No
week.
worries.